Good evening, everybody. A very warm welcome to our first online event in what seems like absolutely ages. During the pandemic, we were doing online events all of the time, and now happily our events seem to have gone back to the real world. But Lee lives a very long way away from North Norfolk, so the best way to catch him is online. A very good evening to you, Lee Schofield. How are you this evening?
Very good, thanks, Nick. You all right?
Yes, I am. Well, now that my fire is getting going, I'm considerably better. I've been teaching all day, so I've got a bit of a. I've been talking quite loudly all day, so I've got a microphone to boost me. Now, Lee, you are is your official title the manager of the Haweswater Reserve? Is that your?
I'm senior site manager.
Senior.
Grey.
Yeah. Senior site manager of the Haweswater Reserve. And of course, we're going to go into the ins and outs of the management of the Haweswater Reserve later on. For everybody who's joining, Lee is here, of course, to talk to us about his wonderful, beautiful book, Wildfell, and the broader context of the work that he and a whole team of staff and volunteers are doing at Haweswater with the RSPB and very many other partners. If you have questions for Lee, either about his book or about the work that the RSPB and partners are doing at Haweswater, feel free to pop them into the Q&A. Depending on how many questions come, I will attempt to pass them all to Lee, but apologies to anyone in advance if we don't manage to. At the end of the session, obviously, I will let you know when we're going to finish, but it will probably cut off quite abruptly and we'll all just suddenly disappear into the ether. But disappearing into the ether brings me to my first question, really, Lee, which was that the last time I interviewed you, which was when you came to Norfolk last autumn, I read this to you. Let me just find the right quotation here. Excuse me. Oh, now I can't find it. I'm in the right bit and I can't find it. But here we are. It's tough being an alpine plant, especially in the UK. Perhaps because our native alpines are so restricted, they have a particular allure among botanists, myself included. You have to work hard to find them. I still haven't found the purple saxifrage. Now, anyone who likes plants will know, I saw a shake of the head there, anyone who likes plants will know that now is the time to be seeing purple saxifrages in flower. Have you yet found the purple saxifrage at Haweswater?
We have not yet found purple saxifrage, despite a couple of efforts this early spring. It's still eluding us. But one potentially exciting development is that I've learned that Derek Ratcliffe, who I'm sure many of you have heard of, one of Cumbria's most important, one of the country's most important naturalists, but a son of Carlisle. He was the first person to discover. In fact, he was possibly the only person who's ever seen purple saxifrage in Bleak Water. He's the person who recorded it when he was describing Bleak Water, which is one of the triple SIs in the sort of really mountainous bit of Haweswater. And his diaries have just been secured by Tully House, which is Carlisle's Natural History Museum, and so I'm hoping to be able to get the chance to go and peruse them sometime soon and see if there's any clues about where this crafty purple saxifrage might be lurking in the crags, rather than just wandering around excuse me, randomly like I tend to do every spring.
That is marvelous. That's both wonderful because it will give you a feeling for where you might be heading in terms of your rewilding project, but also because it connects you to someone who knew the landscape, which you love and know so well. That's absolutely thrilling. Oh, well, I wish you joy in your encounters with Derek Ratcliffe's diaries. That's absolutely superb. Now, Lee, before we start talking in more depth about your book and your work, you want to share with us, don't you, a film which has been prepared about the work that you're doing, which will, in a sense, serve as a baseline for our conversation. Do you want to start sharing your screen with us?
Yeah, I'll do that. So yeah, this film is it's about 8 minutes long, and it's a series of visualizations that we've had commissioned by an artist in your part of the world, actually, Richard Allen.
Oh yes,
you know, indeed. Richard, yeah, fantastic illustrator, and we asked him to produce a whole series of images portraying both the kind of the before pictures, the ones that the land at Haweswater as we started with it, but then also our vision for what we hope it's going to look like in some decades time, when the fruits of our labours become a little bit more visible. So unfortunately the sound doesn't seem to work on it, so I'm gonna read the subtitles out to you. If you it's available online if you want to go and watch it in your own time sometime, and it's got some lovely little delicate guitar music in the background of it as well. But for now, you'll just have to have the images and my voice going over the top of it. So yeah.
I have to ask a question here, Lee. Is it you playing the guitar in the background? Because you are a talented...
It's not me. No,
it's not you. Oh, rats.
That would be too much. Anyway, here we go. The eastern edge of the Lake District National Park, Haweswater Reservoir sits encircled by looming fells. The glacially carved landscape is studded with mossy woodlands, rocky crags, bogs, tarns, and rushing streams. The whole area is owned by water company United Utilities, and the reservoir supplies 2 million people with their daily drinking water. In 2011, the RSPB began managing Naddle and Swindale farms, which together with their associated common land extend to around 30 square kilometres, roughly a third of the Haweswater drinking water catchment. Working together with United Utilities, we're demonstrating how ecological restoration can work alongside sustainable upland farming, benefiting water, wildlife, and people. This is how the landscape looked in 2011. From this perspective, Naddle in the centre and Swindale to the left, and their associated areas of common land are undoubtedly beautiful, full of Lake District grandeur. However, on closer inspection, major ecological issues stand out. The rich, ancient woodland clothing the slopes around Naddle Farm and the recovering heathland above were isolated, separated from surrounding land by the fences which protected them. Intensive grazing by both sheep and deer meant that the open common land and enclosed farmland were not in good shape, dominated by species-poor acid grassland and bracken. As a result of damaging post-war financial incentives, large areas of peat bog have been drained to try to improve them for farming. This reduced the bog's vital water and carbon storage capacity, creating a whole host of problems for people and for nature. The drainage scars in the bog were visible from miles away. Although England's only resident golden eagle was still present in 2011, he'd been on his own for around 5 years, a clear sign of the landscape's poor condition. Elsewhere on the fells, the bird life was very limited. Upland surveys would often record meadow pipits and skylarks and very little else. Oh my goodness. That's not very good. Sorry about that. In Swindale, the beck ran straight as a canal, having been engineered to drain surrounding farmland at least 200 years earlier, with the unintended consequence of increasing flood risk for people downstream and robbing it of its value to wildlife. The valley's precious hay meadows were in poor shape due to overgrazing and fertiliser use. Supported by Natural England and many other partners, the RSPB and United Utilities are working towards addressing all of these issues and doing so in a way that brings benefits for the local community and economy. Ecological restoration is a slow process in the uplands, but here's what we might expect the landscape to look like by 2050. As a result of both planting and natural regeneration, trees will have spread onto higher ground, particularly in areas dominated by bracken, which indicates where woodland probably grew historically. Many fences would have been removed, and the boundaries between woods, heath, bog and grassland would have become blurry, creating a much more diverse set of conditions for wildlife. There will be more trees in the enclosed land too, with livestock benefiting from the shade and shelter that the infield trees provide. More hedges will give vital habitat for wildlife and help with livestock management. While still recognisably a farmed landscape, the animals doing the grazing will be different. Sheep will still be present, but in lower numbers, and only grazing on the enclosed land within the farm boundaries. Up on the commons, a scattering of hardy cattle and fell ponies, grazing alongside a low density of wild deer, will mimic a natural wild grazing regime that occurred here thousands of years ago. These heavy-footed animals will help to distribute the seeds of trees and flowers and create gaps for them to grow, keeping the landscape diverse. The area's cast of breeding birds will have grown. As reintroduced populations expand, it's likely that white-tailed eagles and red kites will be back in Haweswater's skies, alongside golden eagles spreading out from Scotland. Species like cuckoo, curlew and windchat will be thriving thanks to the healthy mosaic of habitats. Looking at the landscape from this lofty perspective can only show so much. We must look more closely to appreciate the finer details. By blocking drains and revegetating areas of bare peat, the bogs will be wet and wild again. Without the drains, the flow of water through the landscape will be slower, encouraging the growth of healthy carpets of sphagnum moss, locking in carbon from the atmosphere as they grow. Carnivorous sundews, fluffy cotton grass and bright yellow bog asphodel will thrive in the damp conditions, as will dragonflies, snipe and curlew, and many other wetland specialists. Black grouse will be back, making use of the bog and the scrub on the dry ground. Having had its bends put back, the Swindale Beck will meander through colourful hay meadows, which will still be managed in the traditional way to provide flowery hay to the livestock during the winter months. Freed from the man-made constraints, the beck will spill out onto the floodplain more frequently and periodically change its course as natural rivers do. The beck's gravelly bed will be a spawning ground for salmon, and banks will be home to waterfoals, otters and kingfishers. Down in the mossy woodlands, pied flycatchers, woodcock and red squirrels would have been joined by pine martens, helping to keep the grey squirrels under control. Through the careful management of deer, there will be a healthy mixture of young and old trees. These woodlands are our native rainforests, and by enabling them to spread, we will ensure that species like tree lungwort lichen and pied flycatchers will have a secure long-term future. Other new species will have arrived, whether through reintroduction or by natural spread. Beavers will be working their magic in wetland areas such as in Naddle Valley. By holding back water with their leaky, filtering dams, they'll not only help to reduce flooding downstream, but they'll also keep water in the landscape for longer during dry spells, contributing to a sustainable, clean supply into Haweswater Reservoir. The wetlands they'll have created will be teeming with amphibians, water voles, fish, birds and insects, providing a wonderful wildlife spectacle for visitors. By 2050, we'll have shown that our approach is as good for people as it is for nature. A sustainable farming operation, the tree nursery, wildlife hides, accommodation, education, scientific research, and a range of other activities will provide an array of diverse employment and volunteering opportunities, helping to support the local community. Over the course of centuries, Naddle and Swindale, like all farms in the Lake District, have responded to the changing demands of society. By focusing on improving water quality, reducing flood risk, improving wildlife habitats, and locking up carbon in trees and soils, alongside sustainable food production, the RSPB and United Utilities are continuing in that proud tradition here at Wild Haweswater. There we go.
Goodness me, Lee. Honestly, I want to applaud. It's, first of all, your delivery, which was absolutely beautiful, but also just the scope of the ambition, what you're attempting to achieve, and indeed will achieve in partnership with local farmers, with the community, with the water company. It's magnificent. And I'm sure everybody will be very keen to watch that film again. So they can find it on the RSPB's YouTube, or specifically the Haweswater YouTube.
I think it's on both, but yeah, if you just go to wildhaweswater.co.uk, sorry, let me just, my dog out of the room. Yeah, you'll find it really easily on the first page. Hang on.
Don't you worry. So if you go to the Wild Haweswater website, you'll be able to find that amazing visualization of the changing landscape at Haweswater and see the work that Lee's in the process of delivering. I did an event online last night with the lovely Nick Acheson, whom you know, and a dog burst in the middle of the conversation. So it seems to be a bit of a thing at the moment. Now, Lee, let's zoom in. I mean, there's so much to talk about in the film, but let's zoom in on the river, because just this week you've been treading the celebrity boards about the river and the rewilding work that's been done around that. Tell us a little bit about what you've done. Tell us about the interest that it's sparking and the allies and partners that you have in the work that you're doing.
Yeah, so the river was as straight as a canal, as the video explained, when we took over the tenancies. So it was straightened a couple of 100 years ago, embanked with sort of large rock banks all the way down, and then generations of people that had sort of kept it flowing through dredging and what have you, had sort of heaped material up onto the banks. And the reason that river was straightened made total sense at the time for the people that were doing it. There was a small community of people living up in Swindale, 11 dwellings, and they had to work the land like really, really hard in order to be able to survive. They had to do absolutely everything they could to eke out an existence in what is a really rough place to live. Tough weather, thin soils that don't yield much in the way of produce, constant rain pretty much. So one of the things that was really essential to them was to get the water away from the valley as quickly as they possibly could, and straightening the river did that very effectively. It allowed the water just to rush off with lots and lots of energy and carry away a lot of the sediment that it would be carrying off downstream. And they weren't thinking about the impact that had on people down the valley, or even down the catchment as far as Carlisle. They were just thinking about their own needs and protecting their hay meadows from summer flooding. But over time, that straightened river became increasingly degraded as far as wildlife was concerned. As the gravels were stripped out by that fast flowing water, it left a bed that was just made of great big rocks. And as I'm sure you'll know, salmon need rocks that they can move effectively. They need gravel that they can sweep aside with their tail. There was amazing footage in Wild Isles that showed some of that. And if they haven't got that substrate that's small enough for them to move, then it's no good to them as a spawning ground. So in 2016, working with United Utilities, Natural England and the Environment Agency, we put the bends back into that river. So there were some paleo channels on the floodplain, so sort of shallow depressions that you could see where the river used to run. And we carried out a whole load of sort of investigative work, doing trial pits to work out where there was gravel, which suggested where the river used to be previously. And simply by doing something as seemingly straightforward as making the river wiggly again, it's sprung back to life. Basically, it's there's 180 meters more river than there used to be, just because it's a wiggly line rather than a straight one. And when you allow water that much more space and that much more structure to kind of move within, if you like, the water flows in very different ways. So it flows fast in some places and slower in others, and it picks up material where it's flowing quickly and deposits it in others. It carves out shallow pools, and gravel bars form and riffles, and all of those features that a natural river should have that were just completely lacking in that straightened channel. And one of the really critical things that happened was that the gravel bed, the bed of the river, developed a much more natural substrate. So it had lots of smaller gravels that salmon were able to move aside. And 3 months after the work was completed, in the first kind of spawning season, salmon reds were observed in that river again. So, an astonishingly fast transformation. And now, what are we, 6-7 years afterwards, the river is continuing to develop. It's like it's a dynamic living thing again. And every time I go to visit, there's a little bit more of a deep pool somewhere. There's more vegetation that's established, because of course when the water's flowing more slowly, it gives a chance for floating sweetgrass or water crowfoot or meadow sweet in some of the really slow areas, like right at the sort of wet margins, to start to develop. And they provide shelter for the fish and for a whole host of invertebrates, and you get the whole food chain has just kind of rebuilt itself. And so Wild Isles, which had that absolutely stunning footage of salmon in it, I think has really brought salmon to people's attention. You know, it's brought all of our wildlife to people's attention in an incredibly powerful way. But we put out a bit of a press release off the back of Wild Isles, basically saying, you know, these are a fantastic creature, and look, these are some of the things that we can do to try to help them, just to try to raise awareness of the challenges that they're facing, and what some of those solutions are. And so, yeah, much to our surprise, it's been picked up all over the place. And this morning, there was, on Lauren Laverne's Six Music radio show, there was a people's playlist inspired by the rewiggling of the Swindale Beck. And to be driving to work listening to Lauren Laverne talking about Swindale was thoroughly surreal for me. But yeah, I mean, it's, you know, we've addressed a very small part of the problems that face salmon. You know, they have issues at sea, they have issues on migration with barriers being put in their way. And then once they've made that epic journey, then they often end up in a river that just has no suitable spawning habitat for them. So, you know, we've dealt with about 1 kilometre of stream and shown what can be done. But if that can be scaled up and more, you know, more and more miles of water course restored in that way, you know, we can make a huge difference for salmon, as well as slowing the flow to reduce flood risk for people, as well as improving the quality of the water, and as well as making the place just like so much more beautiful and interesting and rich with a whole host of other species as well. So I'm a big fan of river restoration. We should do a hell of a lot more of it.
We really should. I'm sure everybody listening is punching the air and applauding you and your team and your partners for everything that you've achieved. But riffing off that, one of the themes, if people haven't read Lee's wonderful book, Wildfell, it is hugely, hugely, hugely worth it. Indeed, I made some of my closest friends buy it this week. One of the themes that comes through in your book is how much resistance there was initially, and there was even resistance and indeed a certain amount of mocking at the idea that you were going to put the Wiggles back in the river, and there were some nail-biting moments early on. Do you find now, specifically here in the context of the river, that people understand better why you would engage in river restoration and how it's of value to the whole landscape and all the organisms in it, including humans?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think so. I've been at Haweswater for just a little over 10 years. And I think, you know, I really can see the swing that's taking place in terms of perceptions about, you know, all things relating to nature and wildlife. And, you know, that's happening among farmers just as much as it is among conservationists. Not all farmers and not all conservationists, but, you know, there is definitely, maybe revolution is a bit strong, but there is definitely a big movement for change that's occurring now. And partly that's happening because people can see that climate change is happening. Almost everybody can remember wildlife that isn't there anymore, that used to be there. You know, everybody has a story of you know, I remember walking over that bridge and there were loads and loads of salmon under there, or I remember the buddleia bush in my parents' garden that used to just lift with butterflies that I just don't see anymore. And so I think, you know, there's almost nobody who doesn't recognize that there is a huge problem that we're facing and that we need to do something about it. And I think that's a big part. But then I think, you know, for down to the more specifics of your question about river restoration, you know, to undo work that maybe generations of people have invested their time and energy in is quite challenging for a lot of people. You know, if you're a farmer who's been in a place for 3 generations and you've dredged out that river every few years for as long as you've been there, for somebody to come along and say you need to just do the absolute opposite and that's probably going to be good for you, is going to be pretty hard to get your head around, I think. So I think because, you know, our project has matured, because there are lots and lots of other river restoration projects around the county in Cumbria and around the country, of course, people have had the opportunity to go and see what that looks like, to see whether it could be compatible with other land uses. I mean, one of the things that I'm most proud of with the river restoration in Swindale is that we've managed to cut hay from the meadows either side every year since we've done the work. You know, the river, you can comfortably describe the river as rewilding. You know, it is about re-establishing natural processes. but the hay meadows either side are absolutely not rewilding. You know, that is traditional farm management. It requires cutting and grazing and a very prescribed method of management. And those two things are coexisting in the same set of fields, without either one kind of being a problem. So I think that's a really, really important message that I think is starting to get through.
You've hit there on one of the fundamental tensions within conservation in the UK at the moment, which is between the extreme rewilding movement and the traditional management movement. So you can't, for example, a reed bed or a chalk grassland, you can't simply turn those habitats over to rewilding, because they will cease to have the same characteristics that they have, and therefore the precious species that live in them will cease to be. And so there are those who would lobby for that sort of management, and there are those who would lobby for a much broader sweep across the landscape. But I think you're absolutely right that we need to find that place of balance between the two, because they both achieve different things.
I expect most people who are proponents of sort of targeted conservation management would very much wish that it wasn't necessary. You know, chalk grassland habitats, reed beds, in a really large scale functioning ecosystem, you would have those habitats being created and destroyed in patches, in a random fashion throughout time and space. And every conservationist wants that. We want nature to be able to look after itself, but that's not the world that we live in. We live in a country where our habitats are heavily fragmented, where those natural processes have been hugely suppressed. And as you say, if we take our foot off the gas in looking after those little fragments of habitat, then they will just turn into something much less valuable. So rewilding has a really important role to play, but absolutely so does traditional conservation management.
I couldn't agree with you more. We need to stop shouting at each other about philosophical approaches and accept that both, as you've proved in the River Valley, are very valid and compatible alongside one another. Now, before I move on to my next question, which is about specific management, leading off what you said, we had a question come in. Now, I'm smiling because I know the answer to this, having read your book and having spoken to you in person before, but Margaret and Henry Blowy have asked, in the context of partnerships and other farmers and the sea change, hi Lee, are you familiar with the book by James Rebanks, The English Pastoral? He's based in Matterdale.
I am indeed. Yeah, I'm good friends with James. We don't agree about everything, but we agree about quite a lot. Our kids go to the same school together, actually, and he lives about 3 miles away from me. So yeah, I mean, James is absolutely inspirational. He's transformed the way that he's looking after his farm, and more than that, he's inspired a huge number of farmers in a way that somebody like me, who works for a big organization like the RSPB, just never could hope to do so. He has authenticity as far as many farmers are concerned. He's been farming, his family have been farming in Cumbria for something like 800 years, more or less, in this local area. And that means an awful lot, and there's lots of things that he's doing that we're doing at Haweswater too, and I think we've kind of inspired each other in some way. So he's done some river rewiggling. We're busily doing lots of kind of really wide hedge margins, which he's kind of pioneered locally here. But there's also things that we're doing that are different. He is a great lover of sheep. I'm not particularly. Sheep are quite challenging from a conservation point of view, but that's his primary motivation is rearing really good quality sheep, and so that kind of constrains some of the things that he can do. So he's done really great work on his enclosed farmland, but up on his common land, where he's one of, I don't know, a dozen maybe commoners, there's not that much he can do, and his common is in pretty, it's not in great shape, frankly, and there's not anything that he can do about that by himself. We're in a situation where we're managing common land where there is just us and one other commoner who basically shares our vision for the common. So we're able to work on that common and restore it at quite a big scale that James isn't able to. But, I think James and the growing number of other sort of regenerative, nature-focused farmers in the lakes are really starting to change the dial now, and you can see it's much easier to see that the farming community is not just a monolithic thing. You know, it is full of people with a very broad range of different views and approaches. And I find it really inspiring to know that there are some people that I you know, share a huge amount of my views about the world and the natural environment, and you know, have to accept that there are a whole bunch of people who don't, and that's just the way of life, I think.
And one of the things that comes across really beautifully in your book is that you, later on in the book, you talk about the fact that as lovers of the landscape, as lovers of the wildlife that inhabits the landscape, and traditional ways of life, you have so much in common. And you can agree to disagree on the ends, but the whole middle bit of your view of the land and your love of the land and your care for the land is common. And that a big part of your work over the last decade has been finding that common ground. Just before, I still have a question in mind I want to go back to, but just, you've been referring there to the commons. Do you just, for the sake of us lowlanders, do you want just to explain how the system of commoning and grazing works, and the moving of livestock throughout the year? Because it's not something that we in lowland England really have much experience of.
No. I mean, everybody did once upon a time. You know, common grazing was a pretty common feature of the whole of England. So basically, the commons are, you know, they were historically referred to as the manorial wastes. They were the crap bits of land that the big estates didn't really have much of an interest in. So they were prepared to let the peasants make use of them. And their customary rights to graze animals, to cut firewood, to cut turf, you know, cut peat for burning, to fish, were all things that the big estates granted to their peasants effectively. And that system has sort of evolved over time. Commons were the areas that somehow survived the enclosures. So in the Lake District, where the land is just sort of so steep and harsh and almost impossible to kind of put fences and walls up around, these big open areas remained unenclosed. And slowly those common rights became attached to specific properties rather than to people. And the system as it works today is that a common is a block of land that's owned by one person, but over which others have these sort of specified rights to exercise over that block of land. So for most places in the lakes, the only right that still exists or that's still worth exercising is grazing, because most of the upland commons don't have any trees anymore. People don't tend to burn peat anymore, and fishing is normally controlled by the estates or by kind of you know, fishing groups or whatever. So each farm in the lakes has a specified number of sheep or cattle or horses that it's able to put up onto the common at a particular time. And some commons have got lots and lots of commoners, and others have got a very small number. And it's a lot easier to deliver change on the ones that haven't got that many people than it is the ones that have got lots of people. Because in order to get a stewardship scheme, for example, to deliver some sort of habitat improvement on a common, every single commoner and the landlord has to agree and has to sign up to that. And when you consider that, you know, it's not uncommon for multi-generation feuds to exist between different kind of farmers in a particular area, it's, yeah, you know, just getting them all in the same room to talk about stuff is not always very straightforward. So it's probably, common land is probably about the hardest class of land to deliver improvement on anywhere in the country, I would have said, and is in, generally speaking, pretty terrible condition. You know, most of the upland commons in the Lake District are heavily grazed, hugely lacking in scrub and woodland, you know, really not great places for wildlife at all. So yeah, one of the big reasons that the RSPB took on the farm tenancies at Haweswater was in order to try to wrestle with that issue and try to understand how we could go about making change on commons, and then advocating and demonstrating how that could be done to others.
Thank you, Lee. If anyone's, many of the audience I'm imagining are Norfolk people. If you haven't looked into Norfolk Commons, I really recommend looking at Faden's map, which was made in the 1730s and shows the extent of commons across the county of Norfolk. And effectively, as you'll know if you're interested in geology in Norfolk, huge areas of the county are covered in sand, which was distributed by three sequential ice ages, and essentially all of the sandy areas were common land up until the enclosures. And it's really only in the 20th century that they've been abandoned. And I'd say, ironically, that in fact, we have the opposite in Norfolk, that grazing has disappeared altogether. Almost no one exercises common rights to graze anymore, especially not up here in North Norfolk. Down in South Norfolk, to a certain degree, they still do. And in fact, our commons are scrubbing up. They're becoming much more habitat for scrubland wildlife than they are for grassland wildlife. So we have in a sense, the opposite problem. But talking about the flora, I just want to read to you a couple of things from your beautiful book. So here we're talking about the upland flora again. Most of the Lake District's millions of annual visitors come for the grand views, but landscapes like these operate at multiple scales. When I walk in the hills, or anywhere else for that matter, my attention is split between the macro and micro, between the panorama and its texture, the scene and its characters. The countryside contains so much more than you see on a postcard. It is an intricate composite of tiny parts stitched together in a living tapestry. And then later on in the same passage, in order to get our eagles back, we're going to have to start with the flowers. In order to look up, we must first look down. I didn't anticipate it, but a focus on flowers was to put me at odds with an influential slice of Cumbrian society. So tell us, Lee, you've been talking about rewilding. You've been talking about changing, when you were showing the film, about changing the grazing regimes up on the commons. You've been talking about rewiggling the river. These are more broad scale processes, but then you also talked about the micromanaged habitats, and you've actually been working together with a slightly surprising group of people to propagate literally thousands of native species gathered locally, which is an absolutely inspiring project. It's so exciting to me as someone who loves plants. Tell us a little bit about what you, your team, and your partners have been doing for Britain's alpine flora.
Yeah, we've had a nursery operation at Haweswater for decades. Like, well before we took on the farm tenancies, we had a small nursery and used to work with United Utilities to do sort of planting projects of juniper and other sort of native trees around the reservoir edge. And then a couple of years ago, we secured a grant to extend that nursery operation, and we converted a redundant sheep barn into a wildflower and tree nursery. And a couple of years on, it's absolutely teeming with plants. We're just about to do an extension for it to increase its size by about 50% again, just because Joe, our tree nursery officer, has just been so successful that we've just run out of space like incredibly quickly. So, you know, if you're a visitor to the Lake District, you know, flowers aren't the thing that springs to mind, really. You know, you're walking across the fells and it's generally short grasslands. Coarse grass is often it's Molinia, it's more mat grass, it's deer grass. You might have some Tormentil, you might have some Heath's bedstraw in some places, but generally speaking, you won't be seeing that many other flowers once you get up, certainly up onto the kind of the higher ground and the common land. But if you're prepared to work a bit harder and kind of, you know, get off the beaten track, and, you know, I mean really off the beaten track and up into some of the cliffs and crags, actually you get this unbelievable sort of surprise of huge diversity in some places, particularly in the areas where you've got a sort of a limey influence, sort of calcareous rocks coming through. You can get just absolutely astonishing diversity of plants growing beyond the limit of where the sheep and the deer can reach. And those plants, they're actually technically referred to as U17 tall herb ledge vegetation community in the natural national vegetation classification system. But actually, that's a complete misnomer. You know, we find them on cliffs and crags, we find them on ledges. But if you visit, you know, Norwegian uplands or anywhere in the Alps or the Picos or, you know, pretty much every European mountain range, you know, you'll see these same flowering plants or, you know, the same kind of basic community just all over the place on level terrain, as well as kind of going up in these cliffs and crags. And the only reason that they're there, the only reason that they're only there in the Lake District is because everywhere else has been grazed so heavily over such a long period of time. And so, you know, rather than just, so we can do lots to try to encourage them down by changing grazing and reducing the pressure on the land around these refuges, but just letting them do their own thing is potentially going to take a really, really long time. So we've decided to intervene a little bit and you know, try to undo some of the human-induced damage that's been done over time by collecting seeds, propagating them in our nursery, and then planting them back out into the wider landscape again. And doing that by itself isn't necessarily going to bear much fruit because, you know, a lot of these plants, although they would like to be more widespread, they're not brilliant competitors. So there's a fairly real risk that they would be outcompeted by grasses and things if you simply just plug them back into those sorts of places. So we need to kind of do that work, but then also make sure that the grazing regime is right, so that we're creating that dynamism and animals are there to be able to move seeds around the landscape, and cattle can you know, create holes in the sward so that seeds can fall into it. But some of the species that we're working with are, you know, really quite astonishingly rare. There's one called pyramidal bugle, which grows just in a single locality in the whole of England, on just over the watershed from where we are at Haweswater. And so we've collected seeds from that, working with a chap called Simon Webb at Natural England, who's a brilliant botanist and naturalist. And we've probably now got as many plants in the nursery of pyramidal bugle than exist in the wild in England. And the next phase is to start planting those back out into suitable locations in the hope that it will start to spread again. Because this one plant in its one spot in the lakes is so vulnerable. It's growing just above the limit of where the sheep can reach, and if there's a single rock fall, then, you know, potentially it's wiped out. And every year it produces seeds, and they rain down off the cliff into the area that's grazed, so they never get the chance to grow back again. So there's some people that get quite kind of bothered and see that as meddling. I've heard the phrase forging nature's signature. So, you know, there's this suggestion that, you know, these plants are supposed to be that rare, and it's like, well, that's obviously nonsense. You know, there's no way that a plant can ever just have been in that one place. So my view is that actually it was human activity that made these things so rare. It's absolutely justified for human activity to try to make them a bit less rare again.
I couldn't agree with you more. And you make the point in the passage about pyramidal bugle in your book that countless other species, which are only known in Scotland, may well have been tipped over the edge in the Lake District without anyone ever knowing, quite simply because, in that way, by the pressure of sheep grazing in the uplands. And in a Norfolk context, we at Norfolk Wildlife Trust do similar. We have a reserve at Weeting, on the edge of our Weeting Reserve, where we initially, for the first 40 years of its operation, it was actually the farmer who worked in partnership, but it now belongs to us at Norfolk Wildlife Trust. And we farm a traditional Breckland variety of rye organically and rather badly, because it's the last field in the country where numerous arable plants can grow. So 99% of the British population of fingered speedwell grows in this one plot of rye that's been farmed organically and badly by us and our neighbouring farmer since 1970, because it's the last place left. And if that's forging nature's signature, then I say bring it on, because there's nowhere else that these things exist. Now, you've talked about, in fact, before I move on to the next one, tell us, you made a mention there of Norway, and there's a beautiful, beautiful passage in the book about your sabbatical to Norway. Compare and contrast sheep farming in Norwegian uplands and sheep farming in Cumbrian uplands, and why is it that in Norway you have this spectacular and diverse flora, the things that you would only find at Haweswater hanging from a crag for its very life, you find carpeting the ground on your wonderful walk through Norway?
It's really history is to thank for Norway's diversity, and it's kind of a tragic story in a way. Norway was a very, very poor place. We think of it now as being one of the wealthiest countries on earth, and that's thanks to North Sea oil. But before North Sea oil was discovered and exploited by the Norwegians, it really was a very poor country, and rural people were particularly badly off. And things got so bad that in the sort of from the mid 1800s, there was just mass emigration. People just couldn't take it anymore, and they upped and left, and huge numbers of people went off to the States. And that's, there's quite a big kind of Norwegian heritage in particularly in the West Coast, I think. And that basically just took the pressure off the whole of the landscape. Up until that point, Norway looked quite a lot like the Lake District or Scotland. It was almost an entirely open landscape. People cut peat for fuel, and nobody's going to burn peat if there's wood available. So that that tells you that the trees had gone. And there's photos from the end of that period that show just what an open and barren looking landscape it was. And when people left, refuges, just like those ones that we've got at Haweswater, had the opportunity just to kind of spill back out into the wider landscape again. And Norway's landscape, particularly in the southwest, is very similar. It's glacially carved glens with little refuges and cliffs and crags where pockets of woodlands, particularly birch and willow, had managed to hang on. So along with all those wildflowers, they just had a century pretty much just to kind of do their own thing, and just repopulated the whole of that landscape, or reflowered and treed that whole landscape. Norway now obviously is a very different place economically, and farming has actually moved back into a lot of these places. The farming up there traditionally had been one where of transhumance. So people would move up into these hill pastures. They would have little summer farms called setters, and that was where they would reside, and they would shepherd their livestock, and then they would move back down to the coast again when the snow came in, to keep their stock over the winter months. And the farming that's moving back in is broadly similar to that. People are starting to make use of these setters again, and there is a real deep pride in farming. People really feel themselves to be a farming nation, and sheep farming in particular. But the difference between the farming that's practiced up there today and the one that's in the lakes is one of numbers and density. So a typical, at the kind of a typical lower end, I suppose, of the Lake District is you maybe have 1 ewe per hectare. A typical grazing regime in southwest Norway is 0.2 ewes per hectare, so a fifth of the grazing density. And because the habitats are so robust, because there is so much growth and vigor in all of that growth, that actually the plant life can absolutely cope with that kind of grazing level. And in fact, it probably does some good. It probably helps to kind of open up and create a bit of structure here and there. For us, even if we were to go back to, if we were to convert to that kind of 0.2 ewes per hectare level from now, the challenge would be to get the plant life off the floor effectively, to get it from its very, very heavily suppressed state that it's in now to something with more trees and with more flowers. So the approach that we're taking at Haweswater, and I think a growing number of others are taking as well, is to recognize that rest is really important, and to allow some of these habitats that long period of rest, whether in a fenced block, within a kind of larger area of land, or within a whole kind of contiguous block of land, if that's what can be made to work for the kind of the farmers and landowners. And I think in the longer term, I quite like the idea of sheep farming back at Haweswater again, once the habitats are robust and resilient enough to take that, and to reinvigorate those kind of traditional farming methods, which really always involved people being with their livestock, actively moving them around, as they still do in the Alps and in Norway, but which has largely been forgotten in the lakes. So really, Norway was hugely inspiring to me and hugely educational, and just showed what our uplands could look like if we so chose.
Well, you're leading the way, and with others, with all sorts of allies, including James Reed Banks, you're moving towards that vision. Now, moving up from the ground flora to a slightly scrubbier flora, I'm going to quote one tiny line which I adore from your book. "There is no tree as hungry for life as a willow," which is just a beautiful way of describing some of the last remnants of hill scrub. Tell us about what it means and what other species go with it, and your vision for the recovery of upland, scrub and tree-lined woodland.
Willows are hugely important, and they're also hugely palatable, and that's the reason that there aren't that many of them in the Lake District. They are the first plant that sheep and any other livestock go for. It's the willows are the origin of salicylic acid, which we've sort of synthesized in order to make aspirin. So it's got all sorts of medicinal goodness for it. All sorts of medicinal goodness. Lots and lots of invertebrates make use of willows. And there's a huge diversity. Quite often people think of willow as a tree. It's like, well, there's about 50 different species or something, or different hybrids. And if you've got willows growing, then that's a sign that things are going in the right direction, that your grazing level is kind of sustainable. And if you're seeing them regenerate, then that's a really positive sign. And in Norway, the most exciting habitat for me to see was the montane willow scrub that grows sort of, right up almost to the windswept kind of fell tops. And when you're walking in montane scrub, you're accompanied by blue throats singing at you, and black grouse and golden eagles hunting over the top. And because a lot of these montane willow species grow in a kind of really sort of sprawling form, lots of light is able to penetrate down through them. So underneath them, you've got roseroot, and you've got wood cranesbill, and you've got beech fern and oak fern, and huge diversity of plant life. All of the things that we see on these cliffs and crags at Haweswater, but they're just lacking their willow. They're not really, it's tall herb ledge vegetation. It's even more of a misnomer than I suggested earlier. What it really is montane scrub that's just lacking all of its trees. So we're growing dark-leaved willow, tea-leaved willow, downy willow, eared willow, creeping willow, as well as the kind of more common grey and goat willows. And trying to get them going in the nursery, but also just doing the brilliant thing that willow does of just cutting stakes and planting them straight into the ground. And that's kind of what I meant about them being so hungry for life. You can just, if you cut a willow stick, it will come into bud and maybe into leaf just if you leave it on your table. It's just like it's an incredibly hard tree to kill unless you start eating it all the time, if you're a sheep. So willows are just absolutely fantastic, and we want lots and lots more of them, and we'll be planting lots and lots more of them over the coming years. In fact, I've just been all day today, and it was amazing I can talk at all, because I've been completely square-eyed working on a countryside stewardship agreement, where we're hoping to get funding for 86,000 trees to go up onto Mardale Common. A very large proportion of those will be willows. So yes, long live the willow.
Long live the willow indeed, and long live the work you're doing to support it. Just a question out of my own interest that's come out of this. One of the issues we have managing commons here in the lowlands is that their nature is enshrined in law, and each different common has different laws around it. And one thing we can't do without an act of parliament is fence a common, which hasn't traditionally been fenced. So when you're creating exclosures, when you're keeping cattle, sheep, horses out of areas of your commons on the tops, how do you manage that legally? Or are yours commons which legally can be fenced?
No, so we still need Secretary of State permission, and there's a prescribed process that you have to go through, and you have to consult Uncle Tom Cobley and all, and they can express their views. But actually, it's a lot of work, but fences are allowed if you meet a certain set of criteria, and one of those is furthering kind of nature conservation objectives. I mean, we're increasingly trying to find ways to not need the fences by managing the livestock and also managing the deer. Deer are a big problem for us. We've got far too many of them. We need to get the numbers down. So, you know, fences are a last resort, really. We have used them on some of our commons and gone through that consenting process, and it's delivered really good results. But, you know, whenever you've got a fence up, you're obviously limiting what you can achieve to the areas within those fences. And, you know, we want to be working at a landscape scale. And, you know, we've got the opportunity of working at a landscape scale is really growing at the moment in Cumbria. So we've linked up with the Lowther estate, who are just to the north of us, who own 90,000 acres, I think, in Cumbria. Other big landowners, I was saying earlier, I was showing the Duke and Duchess of Devonshire around yesterday, who are thinking very much about how they can and sort of renature a lot of their land as well. And because government grant schemes are changing to be more focused on the delivery of public goods rather than just supporting farming for farming's sake, lots of big landowners particularly are moving in this kind of direction now. They're following the money, but all of the ones that I've been speaking with are actually really genuinely quite excited about it as well. You know, they want to invest in their land again and get nature back. So I think there are some reasons for optimism about some really positive changes in the countryside at the moment, among the grim ones.
That is magnificent, and it's so rare to talk to someone who works in conservation with a spring in his stride, from having achieved so much and from seeing the impacts of that moving on. Just while we stay for a moment with upland scrub, in terms of vertebrates, what is the assemblage of animals you'd like to see return to your upland scrub, given that you are hugely increasing its footprint on the commons?
So, I mean, lots of species that, you know, we still have that are quite suppressed in numbers. So ring-ouzel, it was a really educational experience in terms of my understanding of what ring-ouzels need going to Norway. So we have typically around about 15 pairs of ring-ouzel at Haweswater that nest up on the crags. And generally their territories are quite large. They're quite sort of spread out from each other. You have to work really, really hard to go and survey them or hear them. When I was in Norway, they were just an astonishingly high density. And I'm sure that that's because they are in fact a species of montane scrub rather than a species of cliffs and crags and tightly grazed grassland. So I'm pretty confident the ring-ouzels will benefit. I mentioned blue throats earlier. You know, blue throats do occasionally come and breed in Scotland. I think if we could restore reasonable quantities of montane scrub, you know, I don't think it's beyond the realm of possibility that we get blue throats back in. And, you know, wouldn't that be something? Black grouse, we're looking at the possibility of a black grouse reintroduction. So black grouse are a very, very choosy bird. So they need scrub. They need youngish woodlands. They need areas of short grass for lecking. They need bogs and they need heath. They need the whole kind of shooting match in order to be able to survive. So I think, you know, more scrubby woodlands sort of creeping up the fell sides would be a good thing for them. And then once you've got black grouse as well as red grouse, and one of the things that I didn't mention after the film was that you know, a lot of the things that are portrayed in that film we're already starting to see. You know, in response to changing the grazing, we've got a lot more heathland back, and red grouse. Where you have heathland, you have red grouse effectively. You know, they eat the young grouse, the young heather tips, and we recorded red grouse breeding on the common for the first time last year, and that is almost certainly as a direct result of that habitat change resulting from the grazing change. And so where we've got black grouse and red grouse, then there's the possibility that we might have something for golden eagles to eat again. And, you know, that is although it's not our kind of management plan objective, it's what all of us at Haweswater really want. You know, we're rebuilding that landscape from the flowers up in order to try to lure our golden eagles back again. So, yeah, if they would be the crowning glory for the montane scrub and the rest of the landscape.
In case anyone hasn't read your book and hasn't followed the story of Haweswater, I remember as a boy in the 1980s reading about golden eagles at Haweswater and dreaming of seeing them there. Just give us a potted history of golden eagles and their significance at Haweswater, because as you say, the ultimate vision is to have them back over a diverse and healthy landscape.
So they came back in 1969. So they were wiped out, Victorian times, a bit before actually, and their numbers were starting to build in southern Scotland, sort of after the war. So young forestry plantations are actually really quite good for ground game and things. So they can be really good news for golden eagles. But then as those plantations start to close up, they become completely useless to golden eagles. They can't hunt in that dense canopy. So as the numbers were building up in southern Scotland, they started to spread outwards, and then as the canopies closed in those woodlands, they probably started to spread out even more. And that was probably what caused them to start reappearing in the lakes in the 60s. And the first pair made a nest on Heart of Fell, which is the big crag that overlooks the sort of the small car park at the end of Haweswater Reservoir. But being so close to that car park, it was probably too busy for them, and they abandoned that nest in that first year. And the first egg that was laid in 170 years, went cold. So they moved around the corner into Riggindale, and that was where they stayed for the next 45-year period. So from 1970 through to 2015, there were golden eagles in Riggindale, and for most of that period, they were the only territorial golden eagles in the whole of England. There was a second pair out in West Cumbria for a while, but unfortunately they were persecuted and disappeared after a few years. And the ones in Riggindale persisted, really, in large part thanks to the RSPB. We were there keeping the valley quiet, monitoring them, protecting them, because egg theft was still a big thing. And during that time period, they reared 16 chicks. Successfully fledged 16 chicks, and that was 5 birds altogether. So there were 3 males and 2 females. So as one half of the pair died, another would drift down from southern Scotland to take its place. And then in 2002, the last female, the second female, died. She was 30, which is the oldest ever recorded wild golden eagle. And the third male, who was paired with her, who was left by himself. And that's how he stayed for the next 12 years. And every year he would display in the hope of attracting another female bird in. But the population in southern Scotland by that point had dwindled so much that there just weren't enough birds in the vicinity. And so in 2015, during the winter of Storm Desmond, when we suspect he was probably about 20 years old, we never saw him again. We suspect he just starved, probably a bit depressed, bad weather. And that was the end of England's eagles. And the fact that the whole of the English countryside is incapable of supporting even a single golden eagle is a pretty damning indictment of how we've been looking after the place. So that was kind of a hugely tragic thing for all of us, but for us working at Haweswater particularly so. For my colleagues Spike and Dave, who'd been at Haweswater for 20 years, the whole time, the focus was on the eagles. Really hard for them to bear. But hopefully it's not the end of the story. The work that we're doing, we hope, will produce more in the way of wild prey and become attractive for golden eagles again. And we've had a really exciting, tantalizing hint quite recently. So there's a translocation project in southern Scotland that's been bringing birds down from the Highlands, and there's now about 33 birds that are circulating in the Scottish borders, Dumfries and Galloway. And a few months ago, 2 came to visit us at Haweswater. And the really exciting thing was that they came just to Haweswater. So the people running the project could obviously see they've got sat tags on, so they could see where they flew. And they made a beeline. They came straight for Haweswater. They flew around for a day or so, and then they went straight back up to Scotland again, seemingly without sort of looking at anywhere else in between. And there's been studies that have been carried out that show that golden eagles have, preferences for certain landscapes and for certain sites. So there's an eagle crag in Riggindale that was named Eagle Crag hundreds of years ago, before these birds came back to nest in Riggindale in the 70s. So there's obviously something that they can detect from quite a long distance away, whether it's the combination of remnant woodland and heathland and crags for nesting or whatever. But it does appear that if we can get the habitat right, it feels like that it is a realistic prospect that they might come back to visit us. and indeed maybe also even white-tailed eagle. So just next to Eagle Crag in Riggindale, there is a heron crag, and heron is a derivation of ern for white-tailed eagle. And we had 2 of the Isle of Wight sat-tag birds come and visit us at the end of last year. And we saw their flight path too, and both of them had distinctive kinks into Haweswater where they diverted in and then flew off again. And there's actually one knocking around now. It's flying over the Solway Forth at the moment. It flew over Rockcliffe Marsh this afternoon apparently. So all eyes are to the sky at the moment.
Amazing stuff, fantastic. Well, our wingtips are crossed that they'll come back. I'm interested in what you say about that particular habitat type that they seek, because we've now had at least 8, if not 10, of the Isle of Wight birds come and spend periods in Norfolk. And the majority of them have all ended up perching in one tree at Holcombe. Time and again, they go back to the same tree, which looks out over the marsh that's heaving with geese and plovers and lapwings and widgeon in the winter, and they all perch in the same tree. And it is that feeling that they know what it is that they like, and they're telling us in the clearest way that they know what they like. Now, I want to end, Lee. Do remember, people who are paying attention, if you want to ask a question, this is your last chance. But I have one last question for Lee, which is really about diversification. If anyone listens to the Archers, you'll know that farming is all about diversification, but you make a very, very beautiful and heartwarming point that farming has gone from being very diverse to sheep being really the single product that anyone thinks is of any value. And you see a vision in which the whole community of the uplands is reinforced by rewilding. And it's not just biodiversity and our environment that benefit, but it's actually people across the community benefiting financially from the project at Haweswater and expanding across the landscape. Do you want to riff a little bit on that, Lee?
Yeah, will do. Yeah, so when we started at Haweswater, I was one of 4 staff. So we took over the 2 farm tenancies that previously had a farming couple in each of them, as well as casual labour. So we more or less replaced the numbers of people that were kind of working on the land 10, 11 years ago. And then we're just finishing a period of recruitment, but we are now up to 22 people working. And so 15 of those are directly working at Haweswater, based at Haweswater. And then there's another 7 people that are working on a kind of project in the immediate vicinity, that the one I mentioned, in partnership with Lowther Estate. So, you know, straight away, just in terms of jobs, that's a huge boost. You know, we're not necessarily cut from the same cloth as the farming tenants that were there before, but we are all people in the local area. Our kids are in schools, we're buying in shops, all of that stuff. So, you know, we're making just as important a contribution as anybody else. The money that we brought in is absolutely, you know, a very considerable increase on what previous farmers were bringing in. You know, on top of the agri-environment grants, we've had I think maybe £5 million worth of inward investment through a whole range of different grants and projects. Almost all of that gets spent on salaries, on local contractors and suppliers, and then obviously there's all of the kind of livestock stuff and supporting the marts. Even though we've got less livestock, we're still involved in all of that as well. But I think you know, the opportunities, although, you know, we're doing a whole bunch of stuff that we really like. We've got wildlife hides. We're hoping to open a little bunkhouse. We work with a load of different third parties that do pony trekking type activities and sort of other wildlife based things, and they work really, really well for us. But actually, I think there are so many opportunities, particularly in our part of the world where there's so many tourists. You know, we get 20 million visitors a year to the Lake District. Tapping into that to supplement what is almost certainly going to be dwindling agri-environment income, and probably dwindling livestock income as the sort of move towards eating less meat becomes more and more prevalent, it's just the obvious thing to do, and it's the thing that people are going to have to do if they want to be able to survive. And I think we're showing a range of options that could well appeal to some people, won't appeal to everybody, but I think we're showing that you can be, if you dial down the farming intensity, if you dial down the costs of inputs and things, you kind of make space for a whole load of other initiatives and activities, and that's kind of headspace as well as sort of physical space for nature. So yeah, I think there's huge opportunity for people that are prepared to kind of embrace change in a positive way, and I think, yeah, it's not going to be easy necessarily for everybody, but I think there is clearly a future for people who are prepared to think outside the box.
Well, that's a very heartening place to leave. Let's just see, we've got a couple of questions coming in. Gillian Foxcroft says, nearly finished the book, thank you. It's superbly written. I totally echo that, Gillian. Palatable and inspiring. Do you collaborate with other NGOs there at all? And if so, in what way? And then there's another quick question here from Harriet Thomas. Maybe answer this one first because it's less positive, but do you have any thoughts on this sewage and rivers issue that the whole of England is suffering at the moment?
Yeah, I do. I mean, it's a bit of a sensitive one for us because we're obviously working in partnership with United Utilities, and this is not a corporate answer by any means. But United Utilities, they've got some difficult questions to answer, but they are also doing some absolutely brilliant things. The stuff with us, they are genuinely leaders in the field when it comes to catchment management for water quality. They've got the clean water end of things and they've got the dirty water end of things. And on the clean water end of things, they're really punching very much above their weight. The rest of it is, this is clearly a really huge issue. But the media is simplifying it in quite an unhelpful way, I think. So a lot of focus has been on Windermere up here, and there's been a chap, Matt Staniek, who's been a very effective campaigner at raising awareness of these problems. But it's had, in my view, too much of a focus on the water companies. And a study that was carried out for Windermere analysed where the different kind of sources of pollutants and things were coming in from, and 70% of it was coming from farming. A big chunk was coming from United Utilities, sewage overflows and what have you, but the vast majority was coming from farming, and that doesn't feel to me like it's getting enough attention. Yes, the water companies need to clean up their act. The reason that we've got into this situation, though, is really because the water companies were privatized, and as soon as you privatize a water company, that company has to pay its shareholders dividends, and so it's not going to invest in the infrastructure as much as it really should do. And that's the root of the problem. It's the model that's the problem, not necessarily the water companies being inherently evil. It's that they are corporate bodies that have to operate in a certain way, and that was the mistake. But we've got to live with that now, because I don't think the prospect of them being renationalized is very likely. But the issue that it's, this is not me pointing the finger at farmers. This is pointing the finger at the regulator, really. The Environment Agency is not enforcing problems with farming. It's not enforcing its own rules very often. And we see that, I see that locally here time and time again, obvious infringements of very reasonable rules that farmers are asked to abide by that they often just don't. And the Environment Agency are just seen as a kind of a pushover. So the Environment Agency have got a big kind of role to play in this, in improving their enforcement. And the reason they're not doing that very well is because they're not invested in enough either. There's loads of good people working for the Environment Agency doing their absolute best, but they're stripped to the bone, just like Natural England. So, all of this comes back to government and funding and business and the perception that the market is the thing that's going to sort us all out, and it's not. We need better investment in our public services and our regulators.
Thank you, Lee. So just very quickly, Gillian asked as a last question about what other NGOs you collaborate with at Haweswater.
Yeah, loads. We work with Cumbria Wildlife Trust, Woodland Trust. This big project that we've got with the Lowther Estate is funded by the Endangered Landscapes Programme. It involves the Ernest Cook Trust, which are an education organisation as well. So yeah, there's actually, Cumbria is just a brilliant place to work because of the kind of the close collaboration across a whole bunch of different organisations and individual farmers and naturalist societies and things as well. So yes, lots of cross-pollination between organisations and individuals.
Brilliant. Now, could somebody please clone you so we can all have one? Because we need people leading the way in turning our landscapes back to being biodiverse and healthy, and providing environmental services, but also putting money into people's pockets. I'm sure everybody who's listening joins me in congratulating everybody at Haweswater for the amazing work that you're doing, and all of your partners in the wider landscape. Don't forget, people, if you haven't read Lee's book, you can get it from our wonderful partners, Wild Sounds, who stock the books in all our visitor centres. They're wildsounds.com. And if you go there, you search for Wildfell by Lee Schofield, you can find it. Or indeed, you can purchase it in any of our visitor centres, and we will be delighted to share Lee's story with you. So from us at Norfolk Wildlife Trust, a huge thank you to Lee. Congratulations on everything that you're up to. Good luck with the continued success of your work and your book and your media appearances, and a very good night from us all at Norfolk Wildlife Trust. To you all, check back regularly on our website, which is norfolkwildlifetrust.org.uk. And if you want to know about events which are upcoming, there's a tab at the top that says What's On. And we, of course, have our Summer Cley Calling Festival taking place very soon, most of which will take place at our Cley and Salthouse Marshes Reserve. And with that, good night to everybody. Thank you and goodbye.